Hello, everyone. On behalf of Paraclete Press, welcome to this reading of Margaret's First Holy Week from the Pope's Cat series by author John Sweeney. We're so grateful to be able to gather with all of you during this time of separation, and a recording of today's presentation will be available later to share with anyone who couldn't join us. And we'll also let you know how to get a copy of Margaret's First Holy Week and all of the Pope's Cat books. So by way of introduction, John Sweeney is the award-winning author of many books, including The Complete Francis of Assisi and When St. Francis Saved the Church, which is also the winner of the 2015 Award in History from the Catholic Press Association. And of course, he's the author of the Pope's Cat series. So thank you so much for joining us today, John.
It's fun to be here. Hello to everyone, and thanks for joining me so that I can spend time with you as you are spending time at home. We've just entered Holy Week, of course. Palm Sunday was yesterday, and for most of us, for all of us, it was different than it has ever been. But this book that I'm about to read to you is Margaret, the cat's experience of her first Holy Week. So it begins at Palm Sunday, and I'm going to read it to you now. I'm going to read to you, and then I'm going to show you the pictures. So, Margaret's First Holy Week by John M. Sweeney and illustrated by Roy De Leon, my good friend who does such a beautiful job. Chapter 1. The Pope heard Margaret the second he walked into the apartment. He was just returning from morning mass in his private chapel. Margaret was curled up in a ball on the couch by the window, her head resting on palm branches the Pope left there a few days ago after the long, joyful procession through St. Peter's Square on Palm Sunday. Margaret was exhausted. Cats are often, you know, exhausted. It has been nearly a year since the Pope adopted Margaret, and Margaret adopted the Pope. They lived together in the Pope's apartments in Vatican City, the tiniest country on earth. The Swiss guards who protect the Pope long ago learned to open doors for Margaret. The Pope's friends long ago began to regard her as one of the family. But it is still true, there are some members of the Curia, people at the Vatican who help the Pope in his official work, who are not happy that Margaret is around. They believe the Pope is too important a person to be walking around with a cat. And Margaret, well, she sometimes gets into trouble. The palm branches that Margaret had been comfortably resting on were all that remained in the apartment and the Vatican from the celebrations of Palm Sunday. Margaret loved that day, watching people clap their hands and wave their palm fronds, and then the happy mass. She especially enjoyed singing songs about Jesus the King. But that was 5 days ago. Today was Thursday. Margaret was waking up to the 5th day of Holy Week, and she could already tell that the feeling in the Vatican was changing. While she stretched herself out of her slumber, Margaret heard the Pope talking with someone in the apartment. Father Felipe, the Pope's secretary, had come into the room. They were using a strange sounding word. It was nothing she had ever heard in English or Italian. Tenebrae, she heard each of them say. Darkness and shadows, Felipe said as well. That's what tenebrae means. It is a church service that takes place as Holy Week moves toward Easter, when the church is made completely dark. Margaret's ears perked up. Is it scary? She wondered. Then the Pope said, this is one time when everyone should leave with a sense of sadness. Oh my, Margaret thought. She was worried. Tenebrae is a Latin word, and it means just what Margaret heard. It isn't scary, but it is supposed to be sort of sad. Holy Week begins with the joyful celebration and procession that remembers Jesus arriving in Jerusalem on the first Palm Sunday more than 2,000 years ago, but then gradually moves towards his passion. Margaret didn't know what passion meant, not yet. Father Felipe then left the room, and the Pope noticed that Margaret was finally awake. He picked her up, pressing his cheek to her own. He always enjoyed how Margaret's fur felt against his skin. She liked this too. He smiled. She purred. "Good morning, amore mio," the Pope said. Amore mio is Italian. It means my love. "Today is Maundy Thursday," he added. Maundy? More strange words, Margaret thought. She wasn't sure that she was going to like everything that was happening this week. Chapter 2. Just then there was a knock on the door of the apartment. "Is it food?" Margaret wondered. Margaret is always hungry when she wakes up. "Come in," the Pope called out from across the room. In walked a man with a tray, and on the tray, much to Margaret's delight, were several of her favorite breakfast dishes. She saw fresh, warm rolls, butter and jam, a cup of yogurt, and a much larger cup. It was really the size of a bowl of cafe latte. That means warm coffee with milk. Cats don't usually drink coffee, and they probably aren't supposed to, which is why the cooks in the Vatican know to make Margaret's morning latte with a whole lot of frothy milk and very little actual coffee. Margaret grabbed a roll in one paw and began to slurp the latte. While she slurped, some of it splashed onto the coffee table. Then when she reached for the jam to add it to her roll, her paw went right to the bottom of the little dish in which it was set. This meant that for a few minutes, wherever Margaret walked, there were paw prints on the white carpet. The steward who had delivered the tray looked annoyed. The Pope just smiled. The Pope said, "I want to show you my chapel, Margaret. Finish your breakfast." So she finished that roll and quickly grabbed another, but when the jam was all gone, she lost interest. Lapping up the remaining bits of milky goodness in the saucer, she walked over to where the Pope was sitting in a chair by the window, studying a stack of papers. "Ready?" he said. And when Margaret purred back at him, he knew that she was. She still had froth on her whiskers. Now, Vatican City, where Margaret and the Pope live, is situated on the banks of an ancient river, the Tiber. Not Tiger, Margaret wouldn't like that, but Tiber. On the other side of the Tiber River from the Vatican is one of the most historic, ancient, and beautiful cities in the world, Rome. For more than 1,000 years, Rome was the center of Western civilization. Before there was a Vatican City, the Pope was the ruler of all of Rome and beyond, including most of Italy and even beyond Italy, of other countries in Europe. And when popes ruled these vast lands, they hired famous artists to build beautiful churches, galleries for art, libraries, and chapels. And this is the picture of Margaret and her paw prints on the white carpet. And the steward, who was a little bit annoyed. So off went Margaret and the Pope out of the apartment and down the stairs into a corridor. There were Swiss guards all along the hallways as they walked side by side. Some of the guards stood at attention, as they usually do, without looking at Margaret. But one or two of them, who have taken a special liking to her, nodded or winked. The Pope often visits this chapel, but I've never seen it, Margaret thought to herself. As they approached, Margaret saw a line of people who looked like they were waiting to get in. "The Sistine Chapel," a sign read in front of them. "Holy Father, the chapel doesn't open to tourists for another hour," one of the guards said to the Pope, adding, "Would you like more time than that?" No, that's fine. Thank you, Michael. I only want to show Margaret around, the Pope replied. As they walked across the threshold, Margaret's eyes became huge like the saucer that held her morning latte. She couldn't believe what she saw. She had never seen anything like this before on the streets of Rome. She hadn't seen anything like this yet in the Vatican either. Every inch of the walls and ceiling was painted with the most amazing pictures.
John, if you hold that book a little further away from the camera and a little higher up, we'll be able to see it better. There we go. Perfect.
While Margaret began to take it all in, the Pope walked quietly to the front of the chapel and knelt on the stairs in front of the altar. What is he doing? Margaret wondered. But then she looked again at the walls, the ceiling. She almost fell over backward, trying to see the paintings on the ceiling above her head. The ceiling in the Sistine Chapel is 44 feet tall in the middle. That's as tall as 7 or 8 adults standing one on top of another. Looking up, Margaret saw a huge man painted on the ceiling directly above her. The man was reaching out his finger and touching the finger of what looked like another, much older man. Margaret didn't know it then, but that picture is how the famous painter imagined God creating the first man, Adam, in the Garden of Eden. Margaret looked again at the Pope. He was still there, kneeling in the front of the chapel. She walked over to where he was and placed her paws in front of her. His eyes were closed. Margaret looked carefully at him and she began to think. A minute later, Margaret closed her eyes too. The Pope was praying. Do cats pray? I honestly don't know for sure, but it looked as if Margaret were praying too. And that's the picture on the cover. After a few minutes, the Pope opened his eyes and smiled at Margaret there beside him. He made the sign of the cross. Then he got back onto his feet. Margaret did too. As they walked out of the Sistine Chapel, the Pope explained, Margaret, 500 years ago, Pope Julius II asked a great artist named Michelangelo to paint this ceiling. 15,000 people will come through here today, as they do every day, to see these paintings. Chapter 3. As the Pope and Margaret emerged from the Sistine Chapel, some of the tourists who were waiting in line saw them come out, and they cheered. The Pope picked Margaret up in his arms and walked over to the crowd standing behind a long rope. Margaret saw kids with parents and people who appeared to be from all over the world. There were people with brown skin, tan skin, white skin, and black skin. Together, Margaret and the Pope began to greet each person one at a time. Adults were reaching out to the Pope to touch his hands, and children were reaching for Margaret, wanting to hug her. This lasted only a few minutes, however, because then 3 of the Pope's secretaries came rushing up and said, "There is so much to do, Holy Father. We need you to come to the office to discuss the plans for today." Then Father Felipe appeared. Father Felipe works very closely with the Pope on the details of his work each day. "Allow me to return Margaret to our apartment, and then I'll be right with you," the Pope said to Felipe. Felipe nodded. "Of course, Holy Father," he said. Then Felipe and the others accompanied Margaret and the Pope back down the corridor and up the stairs. Once they returned to the apartment, Margaret heard Father Felipe say, "There is so much to do before we go to the prison this afternoon." And then suddenly he and the Pope were leaving the room, walking out into the hallway. "Wait a minute, the prison? Oh my," Margaret thought. She was worried again. She had to do something. What Margaret did not yet know was that Maundy Thursday is the day in Holy Week when we remember Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. When Jesus began to wash their feet, like a servant who takes care of his master, Jesus shocked his friends, the disciples. They told him that he shouldn't wash their feet. But Jesus insisted. He said, "If I, the master and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. I have given you a model to follow, so that as I have done for you, you should also do." That's why Christians wash each other's feet on Maundy Thursday. And that's why the Pope was going to a Roman prison that afternoon to wash the feet of prisoners, showing them and anyone else who might be watching that a Pope is a follower of Jesus and a servant to other people. But Margaret didn't know any of that. Not yet. And when Margaret is worried, she doesn't usually sit still. So as soon as the Pope and Father Felipe left the apartment, leaving Margaret behind, she tried running after them. She made it as far as the hallway, past the Swiss guard, who pretended not to notice, but she slowed down to look at a painting on the wall of Jesus washing feet. Then she didn't know which way the Pope had gone. She had to choose from among 4 different stairways. She picked one and ran down it, but before she knew it, Margaret realized she was standing in the kitchen. The cooks had seen her coming. "My little Margarita," one of them called out. He was from Argentina, where people speak Spanish, and in Spanish, Margarita, which sounds a lot like Margaret, means daisy flower. Feeling at home right away, Margaret jumped up on a counter in the middle of the kitchen. The cooks were just then preparing lunch, and since Holy Week is during Lent, they were not preparing meat. To some people, this may sound difficult or disappointing, but to Margaret, it only meant more fish. And Margaret loves fish. Margaret forgot all about the Pope, the prison, and everything else. She was suddenly hungry again. 2 platefuls later, Margaret was still there on the kitchen counter, busily licking herself clean. "My, what an appetite," the cooks were saying, and "I can't believe it, she eats so much." It was about then that Margaret began to feel sleepy. While the cooks were cleaning up from lunch, Margaret found a corner and settled herself on top of a large burlap sack full of potatoes. She liked the earthy smell of the potatoes and the sack. It reminded her of the Via della Consolonce where she had once lived. Within a few minutes, Margaret fell asleep. The Pope, meanwhile, had finished his work and was back to the apartment with Father Felipe, preparing to leave for the prison. "Has anyone seen Margaret?" he asked, looking around the room. Father Felipe and a steward shook their heads. No. But just then, the cook who called her Margarita carried Margaret through the door in his arms. "Holy Father," the cook said, "Margarita had lunch in the kitchen with us, then she fell asleep." "I hope she didn't cause too much trouble," the Pope said. "Not at all, Holy Father," the cook promised as he passed Margaret from his arms to the Pope's. Margaret was awake again by the time she and the Pope and Father Felipe were in the car driving out of the Vatican. They didn't have far to travel. When they arrived at the prison, Margaret watched as the Pope talked to a small audience for a while, and then as he knelt, as he had done in Sistine Chapel, in front of each man in prisoner clothing, carefully washing his feet with warm water. Everyone was very quiet while the Pope did this. Margaret noticed that some of the men were crying softly, but they were smiling too. Margaret followed the Pope, standing at his side each time that he knelt. She was nervous and uncomfortable at first, not sure what she should do. But by the time the Pope came to the last man and began to wash his feet, Margaret knew. She watched as the Pope washed the last man's feet, and the man leaned forward and kissed the Pope on his forehead. The Pope smiled back at him and said to him softly and quietly, "Mio fratello." That's Italian. It means my brother. Then Margaret leaned forward, feeling more confident now. She licked the man's feet. He smiled at her. Chapter 4. The following morning, Margaret woke early. The sun was already coming up over the buildings. She knew that this day was Good Friday, and that is when we remember and honor Jesus who died for us on the cross. That was such an awful thing that Jesus had to do, and yet we call it Good Friday. Margaret paused and thought about this. She knew the Pope would be busy today. Even though she had woken up early, looking around the apartment, she could see that he was already gone. He was probably at Mass. A few minutes later, he walked into the room and announced, "Today, Margaret, we remember our Lord and his death." Then he picked her up in his arms and added, "Good morning, sweetness." He kissed her on her cheek where her whiskers are. It tickled. Margaret felt happy. She looked in his eyes. "Do you see all of the people outside?" the Pope said, gesturing to the window. He set her down on the table by the window to look. It was a familiar sight to Margaret as she looked down into St. Peter's Square and saw thousands of pilgrims who had come to Rome and the Vatican for this Holy Week, for this holy day. They have come to celebrate the Passion of our Lord and to walk the Via Crucis with us, the Pope said. There was that word again, passion. Margaret was beginning to understand that it meant the suffering and pain Jesus had to undergo for us during the first Holy Week about 2,000 years ago. Via Crucis means the way of the cross. The Pope said, "This evening for the Via Crucis, I will take you to the Roman Colosseum." Margaret jumped down from the table. She looked up at him as if to say, "To the what? Where?" The Colosseum is the place here in Rome where, in the years after Jesus died on the cross at the hands of the Romans, the Roman Empire went on to kill many of Jesus's followers. Margaret suddenly looked frightened. "We'll be safe," the Pope assured her. "Romans don't kill Christians today. That was long ago." Margaret's mind then turned to the subject of breakfast. All she saw on a tray on the coffee table was a bowl of fruit and some cereal. She began to look around the room. Maybe she had slept while the stewards came in and missed the tasty things. She went to the door and looked around the corner. There was no sign of anything else, not anywhere. "We are fasting today, sweetness," the Pope said, noticing her search. "I asked them for a very simple breakfast and lunch. We can eat light to honor our Lord who suffered much." A few hours later, when the Pope left to preside over another Mass in St. Peter's Basilica, Margaret snuck down the hall, down the stairs, and through the corridor to join him. At Mass, the Pope didn't know Margaret was there, but that was okay because Margaret remembered St. Peter's from the day she had spent in the Basilica not long ago on Christmas Eve. In the nave of the huge church, she found an out-of-the-way corner. She listened to the Mass from there. Margaret sat near an older woman who had a guide dog beside her. Margaret and the dog made easy friends. From where she sat, Margaret could hear the Pope as he preached his homily, and she watched him closely as he did something unusual. She saw the Pope lie flat on his face and belly, prostrate on the marble floor. This, she learned later, was in humble obedience and honor to God on this passion-filled day. Margaret had never seen him do that before. When Father Felipe came later that day to tell the Pope it was time to go to the Colosseum, Felipe was worried when the Pope said Margaret was coming too. "Of course she is coming," the Pope said, and then added, Margaret is experiencing so many things during this, her first Holy Week. And then he winked at her. A few moments later, the Pope picked Margaret up and tucked her inside his cassock. Together, they followed Felipe to the car. Chapter 5. The following morning was Holy Saturday, a very quiet day in the Vatican. But that evening was the Easter Vigil in St. Peter's Basilica, which ended at midnight, and then it was Easter Sunday. Margaret knew that Easter is the day we celebrate Jesus' coming back to life. Easter means that Holy Week is over. Jesus shows us what resurrection means. That Sunday morning, bells were ringing in the Vatican and in all the churches of Rome. Margaret could hear those joyful bells, but it wasn't the bells that woke her up. She was up at dawn, ready to go. The Pope gave her a look of surprise when he saw her standing at his feet before he had even gotten out of bed. "Darling Margaret, my, you are up and ready for this special day, aren't you?" he said. She looked at him and smiled. "Christ is risen," the Pope said. At that moment, Father Felipe walked into the room. "Excuse me, Holy Father, I was coming in to be sure you were awake. Big day today." "Margaret already woke me up, Felipe, but thank you," the Pope said. Then he turned back to face Margaret. He whispered to her, "You know what we're going to do tonight to celebrate?" Margaret looked at him with anticipation. "We're going to ask the cooks to make us some pizza," he said. "Not just any pizza, pizza a caballo." Now, if you didn't grow up speaking Spanish, you might not know what that means. A caballo means on horseback, because pizza a caballo has something extra, a piece of delicious flatbread on top. It's like eating a pizza sandwich. Margaret purred and licked her lips. When the Pope was dressed, he picked up Margaret and opened the door to the apartment. There in the hallway, waiting patiently, were Father Felipe and some other members of the Curia. 2 Swiss guards were also there, waiting to escort them down the stairs and onto the balcony where the Pope would give a special Easter greeting to a huge crowd that had gathered in St. Peter's Square. What exactly is going to happen next? Margaret wondered. She thought about this while they walked down the stairs. "Urbi et orbi," said the Pope as they headed toward the open doors and the crowd below. "You remember this, don't you, Margaret?" By now, there were a few secretaries running beside them as well. It seemed to Margaret as if there were people hurrying everywhere. The Pope picked Margaret up. "Urbi et orbi, my dear. Remember, it is time for me to speak to the city and to the world." "What do you think I should say?" he whispered gently in her ear. Margaret thought. She pondered all that she had experienced during her first Holy Week. Then she thought about Easter. She wanted to keep on thinking, but suddenly the Pope set her down on the balcony beside him. Margaret could see thousands of people in the square below. She watched as the Pope approached the microphone that was there. Then she heard the crowd begin to cheer. And that's where the story ends. And the last picture by Roy de Leon is, of course, of the Pope and Father Felipe and one of the cooks and Margaret enjoying their pizza on Easter Sunday.
Thank you so much, John, for reading that to us. If anybody has questions for John about the Pope's cat or about all the things we just heard about, please feel free to enter them in the little Q&A bar. You have a button, I think, on either at the bottom or on the side of your screen. And while you're thinking about that, we'll take this opportunity to do a special announcement, which is that John is going to read another Margaret book next week, the newest book in the Pope's Cat series, Margaret and the Pope go to Assisi. So the plan was that in March, John was going to go to Assisi to do a special launch of this book, but obviously that didn't happen with everything going on in the world right now. So we're thrilled for him to be able to read that for you. So John, we do have a couple of questions coming up here.
Good.
One is from our friend Lisa Hendy, who asks, have you ever been to Holy Week in Rome?
I have not been to Holy Week in Rome. No, I would love to. I have friends who have been there at that time, and it's a very special experience. And I have done, even before we were social distancing and going to Mass online and that sort of thing, I and many others have gone to Mass online during Holy Week and experienced what happens, at least in that way, via my computer. But no, I've never been there in person on Holy Week. I would love to do that someday.
Here's another question. Is Margaret real?
Margaret is very real, but it depends on what you mean by real. Margaret is a fictional cat, and the Pope in the Pope's Cat series is a fictional Pope, although I think that he feels a lot like Pope Francis, and he feels a lot like Pope Benedict and like Pope John Paul II and recent popes. The inspiration for the Pope in the Pope's Cat comes from the recent Holy Fathers, and the inspiration for the character of Margaret comes from the 6 cats that I have loved over my lifetime. So it is a fictional series. Margaret is not a cat who's walking around my house or your house, and I'm not telling stories about a specific cat who is living. But that doesn't mean she's not real. I think the characters in our stories that we love are very real.
Do we know if any Pope has had a pet?
We do know. In fact, Pope Benedict had a cat. The Pope who was Pope before Pope Francis had a cat. And there have been a few examples of other popes having animals. And then there are some saints who we love, like Saint Francis of Assisi, who had a special relationship with animals, not necessarily domesticated cats or dogs, but birds and cows and wolves and rabbits and even fish and bees. There's lots of stories of saints and animals.
Here's another good question. One attendee says, I bet some kids are wondering what Urbi and Orbi is. I saw the Pope recently on TV and they used these words.
Yes, well, in chapter 5, when I talk about Urbi et Orbi at the very end of the story, the Pope then says, he says to Margaret, remember it is time for me to speak to the city and to the world. That's actually a translation of what the phrase is, to the city and to the world.
Here's another good question, John. Catherine asks, what has been your favorite part about the evolving journey of Margaret and the Pope?
My favorite part. I think my favorite part is I love how Margaret shows that it is good to be curious and it is good to think and to ponder. You might notice in the Pope's Cat books that in every one, there are 1 or 2 times when it simply reads, Margaret thought or Margaret pondered. In fact, in the last chapter of the one I just read to you, Margaret's First Holy Week, there's a point where it even says she wishes that she could have kept just thinking. But then the Pope is about to speak to the city and to the world. I remember as a child valuing, loving those moments when I could just simply think and ponder and imagine. And I would love kids to have more of those times, more of those moments. So I think if I had to pick one thing, that's what I enjoy most about Margaret.
Here's some more questions about the Pope himself, which I know you answer some of these questions in some of the earlier books in the series, But someone asks, does the Pope live in a mansion?
Well, a lot of people think it looks a bit like a mansion. Pope Francis, the current, the real Pope, refused to live in the same mansion that previous popes had lived in because it was a little bit too grand. But even where the real Pope today still lives, it's pretty grand. It's pretty amazing compared to where most people live. And it's in the middle of Vatican City, which is a sort of a fortress-like city in the middle of Rome. So yes, the Pope kind of lives in a mansion, but the Pope is also a servant. And the Pope shows himself both in the Pope's Cat series books and also in real life. The real Pope, I think, shows himself to be a servant of people, even though he lives in a pretty amazing place.
John, there are some questions about you now. One young listener is wondering, how old are you?
I'm 13. No, I am 52.
And someone else is wondering, do you have a cat?
Well, as a matter of fact, I have a dog, and we used to think that our dog was not going to get along with cats, but we recently changed our minds about that. I have had 6 cats in my life, and I've loved them very much. But Max, our dog, we thought would not be friendly to cats, but we now are going to teach him how to get along with cats in the way that a dog should. So as a matter of fact, just yesterday, I started the process of adopting 2 kittens. Their names are Martin and Rosa, and they are gorgeous. And I wish I could show you a picture of them, but I don't have it. It's, it's only on my phone at the moment. But we will bring them home, those 2 kittens, we will bring them home probably in a month, because we have to wait until they get to about 2 pounds each, which is the weight when you're supposed to start taking them out of foster care and adopting them and putting them into a new environment. So Martin and Rosa will soon be living in a little peaceable kingdom here in my house with Max.
Someone is wondering if you'll be feeding them pizza.
Margaret does eat some foods that are a little questionable for those who might be responsible for canine nutrition. And so I will not try to feed them pizza, but I imagine that when we are eating pizza, maybe they will be like Margaret and be curious and get into just a little bit of trouble and try it themselves.
Especially if there are anchovies on that pizza, I would think.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Here's another good question, John. With the Vatican closed to the public this year for Holy Week, it's lovely to imagine Margaret there keeping the Holy Father company during this time. Do you know if the Holy Father will be washing the feet of anyone this Maundy Thursday?
I don't know, because I just don't have the sort of inside information on that, but I would be surprised if he wasn't going to be washing someone's feet. It could be members of the Curia, members of folks who are living with him now. I don't think he'll be headed to a Roman prison like he has done in the past, the real Pope. But I would be surprised if he wasn't washing someone's feet.
Here's a question that ties into your love of all things Franciscan, John, because someone's asking if you will take your kittens to church.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. I love the blessing of the animals, which usually takes place, if not at my parish, because it doesn't always happen at my parish. I'm a member of a Catholic parish here in Milwaukee. Sometimes I end up going to another church on that day, just simply for the blessing of the animals ceremony. There's an Episcopal church in town where I went most recently because that was the place to go. I wish that every Catholic parish would have a blessing of the animals. And I also wish that every church would have a blessing of the animals during the weekend of St. Francis's feast day, which is October 4th. And that they would allow the animals into the church. That's when it's really most amazing, and when we can completely sort of experience and see and understand how all of creation is blessed by God, and it's not just human beings. So anyway, that's a long answer to, I will certainly want to take my cats, as I have taken Max, my dog, in the past, to a blessing of the animals service.
And here's one final question, which has a good answer. Are you working on or thinking about a 5th Pope's Cat book?
Yes, as a matter of fact, we are intending there to be a 5th and a 6th. The 6th, I don't know yet what it is. The 5th is already written, and it's being illustrated by Roy de Leon, the illustrator of the Pope's Cat series. And the title of it is Margaret's First Conclave. But that's all I'm going to say.
Thank you so much, John. That's great. So again, thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Thank you, John, for reading to us. We hope you all enjoyed this time together as much as we did. Our prayers are with all of you for health and safety, and we hope you'll be able to join us for more of these times together. Our calendar of Zoom events is available on our website, paracletepress.com. So thanks again. Have a great day. God bless you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.